he doesn't even have anything to say to that. So we're gonna get to this interview with Marty, but first let's take care of this. I was driving past Equality Inn last night at about 11:30 p.m., 12 a.m., and I was thinking to myself, if I went in there and asked them to make a continental breakfast, but not just for me, like fire up all the machines, turn the TV on, get the coffee going, they don't have to make it for 100 people, but the real setup for 10, at least for 10, coming there in the middle of the night. What price, how much do you think I would have to pay, like pay a guy at the front to just fire up the continental breakfast thing in the middle of the night? Hey everybody, welcome back to Labor Street Park. This is our third episode. Our guest today is Marty Hamel, who is an assistant professor of fish ecology at the University of Georgia's Warnell School. I don't have that exact title, so Sebastian, that is the Warnell School of what?
Forestry and Natural Resources.
Perfect. So we're really thrilled to have Marty on the show. Our first guest was an NBA basketball player. Our second guest was a basketball commentator. So we really mixed it up this week. Sebastian, why do we have Marty on the show?
So we have Marty on the show because we saw a recently released article about Pallid Sturgeon and how Pallid Sturgeon in different areas, even though they're genetically the same, can end up having different phenotypes. And it really got us into a debate about nature versus nurture. And that's something we wanted to dive into this article about.
And, this is just a side note, because you're the one that studied this article and I was the one that was 15 minutes late on my homework. But that morning, when we were supposed to interview him, my alarm clock radio wakes me up to an NPR story about a 7-foot, 240-pound lake sturgeon that was discovered in the Detroit River, I believe. It was about 100-year-old sturgeon. The title of the article was Giant Ancient Sturgeon Discovered in the Detroit River, so look that up. So we couldn't interview an actual sturgeon, so we had to do the next best thing.
All right, so yeah, we just wanted to start. If you could just tell us a little bit about, what your title is and what it is that you do.
Yeah, so I'm an assistant professor at the University of Georgia in the Warnell School of Forestry and Natural Resources. And what that means is that basically I do research and I teach classes to both undergraduate and graduate students. So it's a fun job, kind of a fun opportunity for me to kind of satisfy my interests and kind of desires and natural resources, but then work with students and teaching them, various concepts and information, and then giving them hands-on opportunities to get out there in the field and, get their hands on some fish and so on.
That's good. But yeah, the first question we wanted to ask was, so in starting the article, you kind of talk about phenotype plasticity, and just for everyone else, because what is that in layman's terms? Or explain it like I'm 5,
Yeah, no problem. So like phenotypes are kind of like the overall expressions, like how one looks. So you have different traits, body size, height, weight, and so on and so forth. So plasticity is just the amount of variability that, these various genetic traits have. So if you look at a human, for example, we vary in height, pretty substantially, but generally speaking, an adult human is probably somewhere between 5 and 7 feet with a mean of 5.5 feet or something like that. So they're sort of bounded within these terms or these range of values. So the plasticity is looking at how much variation is out there for these various traits. So that could be very little. So that, the total length of a fish, for example, may not be able to change very much, or there could be quite a bit. So like the time or age when these, fish that I'm working with become sexually mature, it could be very young or very old. So Yeah, that's kind of where the term plasticity comes into. It's just looking at the range of variation of various genetic traits.
Okay, cool. And one of the things, plasticity, I guess from reading it, my interpretation was, a lot of it can involve, I don't know if evolve's the right word, but strategy for, competing in life, or just competition in general, with, predation and temperature balance stuff. And I was wondering if you could just talk about that for a little bit.
Yeah, so it is like an adaptive mechanism. So you're thinking about like natural selection and this concept of evolution, like organisms can persist because they have that ability to adapt to a variety of conditions. So a wide range of temperatures and so on and so forth. But that comes at a cost. To be like really flexible on a wide variety of different facets doesn't allow an organism to sort of focus in on specific traits that could make them really beneficial or have really advantageous traits that would make them, thrive in a particular type of environment. So if you're kind of a generalist that can just tolerate a wide range of conditions, you might do pretty well in a variety of environments. But if you have some traits that are really specific to a particular environment, like you could thrive and do awesome. But that comes at a cost again. So if you change that environment, that individual that has those really focused traits with very little plasticity isn't going to do so hot compared to that individual that has a wide range, or kind of that general, sort of life history strategy, so to speak.
So that the cost you're talking about, it's if they are moved into a different environment, that their stats for whatever purposes, like their stats go from 99 to 0 as opposed to like 70s overall.
Exactly.
Okay. All right.
Yeah.
And I understand, after reading your article, kind of how it works with the sturgeon. But just more examples for me would help me, wrap my mind around it. So I was just wondering if you could just talk about the guppies just a little bit more in depth, and how I think the guppies, that was the predation one, right?
Trying to recall back to what that particular example is all about. There's been several folks or researchers that have used guppies as a study organism, looking at these various components of life history. So kind of the plasticity and how some of those life history traits might change in response to environmental variation, or something like predation, where a predator would induce a lot of additional mortality. And the guppies are kind of a unique organism, or a study organism, because they're short-lived. So they become sexually mature pretty quick. And it allows like a researcher to evaluate or study these different facets without having to wait 10 years for a new generation to sort of live out its life, so to speak. So the guppies are just kind of and other minnow or shorter lived species as well. They're just sort of model organisms trying to identify or study these different types or these different factors of life history. And in the guppy work in particular, it's kind of unique. They live in a unique environment up in these mountains in South America. And so because of these mountains are in harsh conditions, they have populations that are isolated from another. And because there's these series of waterfalls, fish can't move and mix, like from a genetic standpoint, they can't breed with one another. So it sets up this really unique opportunity, right? Exactly, to do these types of experiments where you could move one fish that has lived its entire life and all of its generations before have lived in this particular environment. We can move it to a different environment and see what happens, see how much plasticity there is, or so on.
So just from my understanding, because I actually hadn't heard the term before, but garden experiments just like ultra, not controlled, but I guess if you could describe it for me better than I could.
It's a really kind of unique and a cool approach to being able to study a particular mechanism or facet that you want to look at. So you have these two different areas that have distinct genetics or distinct differences in life history traits. And when you take one population or individuals from one population and you can move them into the other, then you can see what sort of responses happen. And you know that's specific to the environmental effects, the location, it's not a genetic effect.
Yeah, so I just wanted to really get into, generally the meat of the article. So you had these fish that were from the upper basin of the Missouri River, and that's genetically where they all came from, correct?
So they actually were found historically throughout the entire Missouri River. So both the upper basin, the lower basin, and even into the Mississippi River.
Okay. And then there's a lot of, environmental factors. I know I think it said they changed the lower basin for commercial stuff, for tugboats. And so whenever they took the fish and started like breeding them, I don't know if the word, was that all different sorts of from upper basin, middle basin, lower basin? Or are they all from generally the same?
Yeah, it's, when you're working with an endangered species, and a lot of this work started with very little information in hand. So, the people that were kind of initiating this effort, they didn't know what they were dealing with, but they knew that in the upper Missouri River, the upper basin, they knew that there was some pallid sturgeon there. And then in the lower basin, they knew there was some pallid sturgeon there, but they're much more difficult to catch, and they probably knew less about that lower basin population. In the upper basin or the upper Missouri River, researchers could catch those fish. So they were able to catch these big adult fish, and they brought them to the hatchery because they decided early on, let's make sure this species doesn't go extinct. We're going to artificially breed these in a hatchery or controlled setting, and then we can take their young or their progeny and we can stock them back out into the river and allow them to grow and hopefully get to an age and size where they can grow into adults and reproduce on their own. But early on, again, like I mentioned, for the first 10, 12 years or so of doing sort of this artificial propagation, they only use those adults from the upper basin. Okay. Yeah, so then they take those progeny and stock them into both the upper and the lower basin.
So they're not brothers and sisters, but they're, genetically the same.
Correct.
For the most part. And so that was the heart of your article. And these fish are genetically the same, but once you place them in different environments, you're seeing different lifespans. You're seeing different sexual maturation ages. You're seeing different lengths, different growth rates. And I was just, kind of talking with Matthew after reading it, and I was like, I don't know if this relates to a nature versus nurture thing at all in some way, but it just blows my mind that these are genetically the same fish, and the environment is causing that much of a difference. And
that's cool to hear you say that, because those are exact same thoughts that went through my mind when I started looking at this stuff. It's really interesting how the environment can have that big of an effect. And one thing I guess we haven't really talked about, this particular species in and of itself is, it has an ancient lineage dating back to the dinosaurs. So these sturgeon have been on our globe for millions of years, and they've evolved into different species based off of the different habitats that they sort of live in. But they've adapted to the systems that they were in for thousands of years. So it was surprising to me that there was that much plasticity that they could respond based off of those really stark contrasts in environmental conditions. It's been really cool to work on it. I don't know if it's a good thing necessarily for the species, but it was really interesting just seeing those results.
Yeah, and we we're just kind of talking about how these fish, they do look like that. They look like that. They look like they're old. You can tell. But one of the things was, since they've been around forever, really the kind of changing of that lower basin areas even though it's been a couple generations, it still feels like the blink of an eye, and like, you know, historically, and just kind of how quick that they've done that. Like, what goes through their, I know you can't get into the mind of a sturgeon, but what is telling them to do that? Like,
that's a great question, because I see this a lot with conversations that like fisheries biologists or fisheries researchers have, because we often compare like growth rates of a one population of fish versus the other, and we say, well, what's going on in this population versus the other? What factors are at play? And we often, people sort of assume that the fish is making this conscious decision, right? So there's a lot of competition, so I'm going to choose to go somewhere else, or I'm going to choose to eat less, or something along those lines. But it's not like, a fish isn't a complex organism that has the capacity to have those thoughts. So it's physiological mechanisms that are driving those conditions, or those responses. So it's related to growth, from food availability, but then also like the metabolic demand. So just as if you were to run on a treadmill for 5 hours at a time, like 5 hours consecutively, like you would burn a lot of calories and you'd have to eat a lot more. Yeah. And that has an effect on your body, like that. If you did that consecutively over and over again, like we would see that you could have a reduction in your overall longevity. So it's these physiological mechanisms in response to metabolic demand that are driving, the ultimate responses that we see. The earlier age at sexual maturation, the growth rates, the overall size, all of that is related to how an organism can obtain resources and utilize them.
So the lower basin ones, they're expending more of that energy, right? And that's why they're maybe reproducing quicker before they,
yes. Exactly.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, it's an adaptation that, like I'm in a harsh condition or a harsh environment, and I'm probably not going to be here for very long. And again, they're not making this conscious thought. They're not thinking about this, but because of that harsh condition, they have that increased metabolic demand. They're in this high velocity environment. So the natural physiological mechanism is to become sexually mature as early as possible.
And so the upper basin, they have a lot. They're more so they're able to grow larger.
Yeah.
Right. Because I know Matthew was telling me today.
Okay, so let me just shift this over, talking about the science to talking about the current events, just because it's not every day when I'm supposed to interview somebody that's an expert in fish ecology that my alarm clock radio wakes me up to a story from NPR about a 240-pound, 100-year-old sturgeon. I guess that they found over the weekend or yesterday. Just for people that, maybe don't know, what's the magnitude of that discovery for people that are in your field? I'm assuming you've heard this story.
So honestly, I have not, unfortunately, which is crazy, right? I'm working with sturgeon, and I haven't seen it, but it's not surprising. And I'm not sure what particular species that was. But it, just hearing it for the first time, it is cool. It's really unique, because it's very difficult to be able to understand just how old some of these organisms are. Like to actually age a fish or any other type of animal is actually quite difficult. We can't ask the fish, we can't ask a elephant, or so on and so forth. There are different ways and approaches that we can try and attempt to estimate age. Like in fish, for example, sometimes we remove bony structures and like cut a thin section of that bony structure, and there'll be rings on it, just like a tree. So we can count those rings. But in some instances, to do that, you have to kill the fish. In other instances, other structures, they just don't produce valid results or accurate results. So a lot of these long-lived native species that have been around, sort of primitive fishes like sturgeon, I think we often underestimate just how old they are. And without having that true understanding of longevity, like it really hinders our ability to manage these fish. Like knowing that they're going to live 240 years. I mean, they're probably not producing every year. They're probably not becoming sexually mature until they're like 20 or 30 years old. So that takes a lot of time in order to produce additional young to sort of rebound a population or anything like that. So it's pretty remarkable, just hearing that.
And so this fish they found, it was in the Detroit River.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, it was
okay. I did hear that. I'm sorry. It was a lake sturgeon.
Yeah, it was and it was 7 feet long, about 200 pounds. Just with some of the factors they talked about in the article were like overfishing and stuff. So they didn't know they even had sturgeon that were this old or this big in there. So I guess my question on that would be, how abnormal is it? I mean, if you came across a 7 foot, 240 pound sturgeon, how abnormal is that? Is that a regular occurrence?
Because that thing could be in the NBA for sure.
There you go. I know you guys are fans of the NBA, so yeah, it sort of depends on the species. So the pallid sturgeon we were talking about before, they just don't get that large. A couple other species in North America are actually quite small. Like you wouldn't see a fish over 6 or 7 pounds. But that lake sturgeon that you're referring to, that was abnormally large. Like you wouldn't normally see a fish that big. So it was, that was just Shaquille O'Neal of lake sturgeon. It was big. But so there are some other sturgeon species that are found in North America. And if you get time after this, you should Google like white sturgeon up in the Northwest, Pacific Northwest. Like these things get to be like 10 feet long and hundreds of pounds. And so you can see pictures of like 8 individuals all holding up the fish because it's that big. So they, different species. Yeah. Well, it's mostly like they're all in the water because you can't even lift it out and they're all have their hands on it. It's pretty crazy. So different species, definitely, some of them get really big.
And that's crazy to, plasticity just between the one species, but is it kind of work the same in between different species of the same fish? Or
yeah, or of the same species, or I'm sorry,
okay, I guess I don't know my terminology that
that's
well,
fine.
but all these sturgeon are the pallid sturgeon or the lake sturgeon or white sturgeon, they're all sturgeon, but they're different species.
Yes, correct.
Okay. Do you know if there's any studies that's been done on those sturgeon in different environments?
Great question. There hasn't been, and it's something that I hope to continue to try and look at. So in Georgia here, I have a project that's just going to be starting up working on lake sturgeon. Actually, I'm hoping to get involved working on a couple other species of sturgeon, short-nosed sturgeon and Atlantic sturgeon, but we don't know what's the overall plasticity is, how these life history traits vary. But just anecdotally, from catching these fish in the wild, we see some pretty big discrepancies in the overall size based off of different locations. So yes, more than likely, there is a lot of plasticity in some of these different traits for all of these different sturgeon species. So it's pretty cool just to see that they have that ability to sort of adapt to varying conditions. And I do hope to be able to try and identify how much plasticity there are for some of these traits in various sturgeon species.
And I would just wonder, I guess studying sturgeon, it seems like, it would be such a niche community. Certain people, you see familiar faces. I wonder when they make the kind of discoveries like they made yesterday, I wonder if you randomly see upticks like in sturgeon interest when somebody posts a story about like an 8-foot sturgeon in some random lake, some part of the country that you're not from.
Definitely. I mean, fisheries as a whole is such a close-knit community. I mean, we all seem to know each other pretty well anyways, but when you really get like esoteric into studying one particular group of fish, yeah, you definitely hear about those types of things. And, it's something that, we're all aware of at some point or another.
Yeah, so I'm pulling up the Facebook post for for that fish, and
Yeah, okay.
it's got like 50,000 shares. Like, that's crazy to me. You know,
It pays to work with big fish, I guess.
yes, it does. Yes, it does. Like the hashtags, is that a dolphin? I like it. Yeah, and you know, just kind of overall, I was just kind of thinking of the human aspect of this. And are there examples of like plasticity in humans that are well documented, or is that, you know?
Yeah, so there's I mean, there's plasticity involved to some extent with a lot of our various phenotype or phenotypic traits. And there's there's researchers that study humans to look at some of these different facets. I mean, even just like body size and versus different regions of the globe. Like, yeah, there's people that study those facets, and yeah, you can sort of pinpoint what factors drive those differences. And when you have
It's probably a lot of the same things, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
It's whatever the environmental conditions are that are driving that. And when a population lives in this type of environment for multiple generations, and you know, it has the ability, or a human, for example, would have the ability to potentially adapt to those conditions. So the plasticity initially may have been wide, being able to adapt to a variety of conditions, but as you sort of become specialized in that specific environment, if the environment isn't fluctuating very much, you may lose some of that plasticity through generation. So again, it can be adaptive in the sense that you're really specialized in that particular environment. But when you move yourself or that person into a new environment, you know, you just can't adapt as well then.
That makes sense. And that could even be in a job or something, right? You know, and I mean, those are the big heavy hitter questions we had. I kind of wanted to see if you had time for just a couple other
Sure.
not so serious questions.
Yeah.
All right. So I was taking a BuzzFeed quiz today and just specifically kind of gearing up for this. And it told me it was what type of fish I was. It said I was a salmon.
Nice.
What type of fish do you think you would be if you were a fish? You can't say sturgeon. Can't say sturgeon.
Gosh, that's tough. Man, you put me on the spot here.
Oh, hard, heavy hitting questions.
Yeah,
I told
exactly.
him not to ask that. I told him not to ask that. Nobody can be put on the spot with what kind of fish they want to be.
Yeah, so I like the salmon, although, you know, Sebastian, you kind of already, you know, took that fish, but you know, something that's hardworking. So salmon, they live their life out in the ocean, their adult life, and then when there comes time to breed, they migrate up these small freshwater rivers, and they get to the kind of the headwaters of these streams where they were born at, you know, a few decades ago. And it takes every bit of energy to persevere getting over rapids and migration blocking barriers and everything. So they're just like hardworking, persevering. So maybe that's kind of what I'm gonna model.
What kind of fish would you be?
A swordfish. Oh, we lost him.
I think you'd be a big fish.
He'll probably jump back on. There we go. There he is.
Yes.
There we are.
So we totally lost power in our house. Like, still
man.
don't have it, but I called you back on my phone.
Oh, appreciate it.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, it's crazy.
That is
crazy.
hardworking
Random thing to
salmon right
happen.
there.
Yeah, I'm sitting here in the dark. So
So I guess in that case, you know, you haven't just lost the power, and with us not wanting to keep you, I guess if you just had any closing thoughts, and you know, sorry that we're doing this interview with your power out and everything. Just if you had any closing thoughts on everything we've been talking about today.
Yeah, no, it's cool to hear other people sharing interest after seeing, you know, some of the work that I've been able to do and publish in you know, manuscripts and whatnot. I'm just lucky to be able to do what I do. It's a really fun position, you know, getting to kind of discover new things about, you know, some of the types of fish that I work with, and then help to make decisions that can benefit those species or or even just humans that like to recreate and enjoy those natural resources. So no, I appreciate you taking the time to find my information and ask me questions about it.
Sure,
Absolutely.
thank you, and we appreciate your time, and we do agree 100% that we think you'd be that salmon, hardworking and determined, and we're looking forward to hearing about the new stuff about the lake sturgeons pretty soon.
Cool, man. Appreciate it.
All right, thank you, sir.
All right, thanks, guys.
Thank you.
Yep, take care.
You too. Bye-bye.
Bye.